Overcoming saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths, we must now face a new enemy, ourselves. With the rates of diseases such as heart disease, stroke, diabetes, depression, and many others ballooning, we must find a better solution to these modern epidemics. Welcome to the Preventive Medicine Podcast. We believe in building a foundation of health by means of prevention so that you can build the life you want and find fulfillment with no barriers. Hear from experts around the country on how to take your health into your hands. Take control and build a foundation of health for the life that you want to live. And now, here's your host, Raghav Sharma. We hope you enjoyed the show, and if you do, please don't hesitate to subscribe and like for all of our future content. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Preventive Medicine Podcast. And in this one, you will hear that, once again, like I said in the intro, I am not in my regular studio. I'm actually in Los Angeles right now doing some life duties. So hopefully you can forgive any sort of disturbances that may pop up in the background, whether it's a car or a lawnmower or something like that. But today we are going to be continuing our discussion on nutrition. And once again, we're not talking about specific macronutrients, micronutrients, anything like that. We're taking a step back and looking at those contextual factors and the bigger picture of nutrition, kind of different things that influence our lifestyle. And very happy to welcome Alan Flanagan onto the podcast. He is a phenomenal person to follow if you are not already, so I'll make sure to link his Instagram and his social media links and Alinea Nutrition as well down below, so go check those out. But welcome to the show, Alan.
I'm really happy to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Definitely. So you were formerly a lawyer or barrister, which is a much cooler name for it than what we have here in the States. I read a little bit about what kind of drove you to switch, but I want to ask you from yourself, what drove you to getting a master's and kind of switching and jumping ship to nutrition?
Yeah, so it was always an interest, kind of the way you might have a career and also read, history or something in your spare time. And nutrition had always held that place for me as something I was quite interested in. And in your early years as a barrister in Ireland, you're building your practice and you can have a little bit of downtime, because you're not that busy yet. So I had some spare time and I wanted to put it to good use. And I thought I might do a weekend course, like a diploma course in nutrition, like nothing too heavy, something to basically dip my toe in and see if I liked it at that level, at a more kind of, I guess, formal studying level. So did that on weekends, loved it, got to the end of it and thought, okay, this needs to go. And I had the good fortune of a lecturer on that course kind of taking an interest in me and being like, you should try and think about maybe going on looking to do a master's, which I wanted to do. I wanted something higher level education. I wanted something that could be an avenue into maybe one day either combining, which is my original thought was I have an interest in the food policy side of things, that big picture. And I initially didn't have a plan to leave law. I thought I'll do this and this will be a professional qualification bolt on to what I'm doing in law. So I'll be able to kind of have a little bit of expertise in both. But I got really bitten by the research bug when I was doing my MSc thesis, and the research I did there was in dietary intake in night shift workers. And I thought I'd really like to try and get into research more fully. And that opportunity started to present itself through the university I did my MSc with. So I knew that was going to be full-time PhD research. So when that kind of fork in the road arrived between, do I stay in law and look for a part-time PhD, or do I leave law and go full-time into nutrition? The decision was kind of already made for me. I wanted to really immerse into the world, get into research. And then also at that point, I'd started to build up a public profile with this kind of nutrition science communication side of things. And wanted really to also embrace that side of it and to try and, further develop. So, where I'm at now, obviously with the PhD, started Alinea Nutrition during my PhD and also working with Danny Lennon and Sigma Nutrition. So we produced the Sigma Nutrition podcast and other educational resources there as well. So yeah, my life is now totally and utterly immersed in nutrition as a field.
Yeah, did you find that switch difficult at all? Because I know, being a barrister, I'm just gonna call it barrister now for this podcast because it's much cooler than lawyer.
Yeah.
Did you find that switch difficult because it's not necessarily based in the sciences? I know there's a lot of education required. Law school is very difficult, but it's not
Mhm.
necessarily like critically appraising evidence, nutrition, all those kinds of things. And I know my fiance did a similar switch. Actually, she went from studying to become a lawyer to going to physical therapist. Did you find that switch difficult at all?
Um, Challenging, possibly more than difficult. So the one thing that I do look back on and appreciate now is that yes, look, going to law school it's difficult. It's academically strenuous. There's a lot of reading. There's a lot of volume of information to get through and retain, and also particularly for barristers. So we have a difference in our legal system where solicitors are the ones that work closely with clients, and they have the one-to-one relationship with clients. And barristers, and this is deliberate, so barristers are designed to be kind of one step removed from the client, where really your duty is to
Interesting.
support. Yeah, so it's you've got this separation, so you're not too involved, so to speak. And that gives you a position where you're possibly able to be a bit more objective about the strengths and limitations of a case. You give them bad news if you need to give them bad news. And you learn lessons early on. I mean, I can remember one case in my third year where just on the facts, I thought this was a slam dunk from my side. I thought this is great. And as a result, I got a little bit cocky, didn't probably give the case the detailed scrutiny that it needed. And I got my ass handed to me basically in court. And I came out of that being like, okay, and so the point is that you developed a habit of scrutinizing your own case as if you were your opposite number. It's like, if I'm on the opposite side, what am I looking at here? What am I seeing? And so there's a great lesson in objectivity in law that you can develop. And that skill became really useful for me when I started coming into nutrition, because it's a very interesting fields. Everyone eats, everyone feels like they have a stake in nutrition, even within certain
Exactly.
aspects of the science community. There's incredible bias throughout the field, not just in in the scientific research. I wouldn't say there's as much bias as people say, but in the wider nutrition discourse, there's an enormous amount of bias, and there are scientists that contribute to that bias. So it allowed me to that skill of not being emotionally kind of invested in any of it. And then you do develop critical thinking and critical appraisal skills. And what I just needed to do was to change the framework in which I was applying it. And a lot of that then for me was just becoming more scientifically literate on things like statistical principles and methodology and otherwise. So in hindsight, there's actually a lot at face value, law and science completely different. But actually, at a more epistemic level, there's a lot of consistency. Like, science starts with a question to be tested, law starts with a question to be tried. Both science and law set standards of evidence that dictate whether it's been met or not. And those standards are arbitrary. Like, a p-value of 0.05 is as arbitrary as beyond reasonable doubt as a standard of proof, right? They're both human endeavors, and we have put our own structures on them. And I actually realized that the process of law is very similar to the process of science. So you need to accumulate your evidence. You need that evidence to be of sufficient veracity that someone can decide whether your case is accepted or rejected. And that's what we do in science. You build a case, essentially, to try and show that saturated fat is associated with heart disease, or that dietary fiber is beneficial for, lower heart disease rates or something like that. So you're still doing the same process. And I actually, in hindsight, came to really appreciate that without me knowing it, a lot of my legal training had actually come to really benefit me as I went through my master's.
Yeah. It sounds like from the surface level, you would never think that these two kind of they're similar skills or skill sets behind them. But once you start talking about it, it sounds actually that it is a very net benefit or net positive to you because it's something that once again we were saying is very lacking in the nutrition field, where there's a lack of objectivity. There's a lot of dogma around certain ideas. Even scientists, once they start like whether it's whatever they're doing with their PhD in, or whatever they first start researching, whether it's like let's say low carb diets or anything, they just only stick to that. So objectivity is probably a very net positive for you. And we're going to talk a little bit about education level and kind of dogma a little bit later in this. And that's one of those kind of more higher level things about nutrition. But first, we're going to start off with our first basic question, which is always sounds basic, but always ends up with pretty different answers. And that is, what does preventive medicine mean to you?
Yeah, I remember thinking about this a little when preventative medicine, and I think nutrition fits into preventative medicine for me because nutrition primarily is preventative as an exposure. I think preventative medicine to me is when I think about that as a concept as it relates to the kind of the chronic disease issues that face us in modern society. So these are diseases characterized by long latency periods where factors earlier in someone's life are influencing the disease outcome later in life. And we know that there's this real mix of social and environmental and economic and other factors that feed into the skewered risk in different populations. And certainly in Western populations, that risk profile has become a bit more homogenous. So whether we're in the UK or the US, very different populations, very similar characteristics. So I think of preventative medicine as a systems wide approach to creating conditions in our societies that reduce the burden of disease in those societies, or at least take that burden of disease and dramatically shift people from higher risk to lower risk. So when I think of preventative medicine, I think of it as a whole population type of consideration, and very much a systems and policy focused way of shifting this kind of distribution of disease to get more people either from higher risk to lower risk, or from moderate to lower risk to not having these outcomes at all. And I tend not to think of it at the kind of almost individual level of a doctor performing a surgery, which is, of course,
Mm-hmm.
an enormously vital part of the system. But the fact that your heart surgeon is performing a triple bypass on that individual whose arteries are full of atherosclerotic plaque is precisely what we would like to keep that person off the table in the first place. Um, and so, in that context, it's a systems approach in which all obviously individual medical and indeed nutrition professionals will play a role. But I think the problem that I see it in our societies now is that medicine and nutrition almost exist adrift from what happens in society. So they're playing a purely reactionary role for the most part. We're dealing with the fallout on the back end once people are already sick. And that type of setup isn't going to change unless we really have a systems wide policy and legislative initiative to try and help to shift this. So preventative medicine is basically political, whether it wants
I 100% agree with that.
whether it wants to be or not. It is.
That's honestly one of the reasons, or one of the ideas behind why I wanted to start this podcast, because we do see so much of that fallout from just not being able to have these things on the systems level, and then you have physicians in the healthcare system. I don't know how it is in the UK, but in the US, it's just falling apart because there's too many patients, not enough physicians, not enough healthcare to go around, and then you have poor outcomes, and just it's not a good situation. And I want to ask you, you mentioned those. The policy level and in the legislative level and all of that, and even nutritional science, we've kind of evolved a long way over from when
Mhm.
we were our ancestors, as some people like to put on Instagram. And I love your stories on that, by the way, the ancestral diet.
Yeah.
um, our diet looked very different previously, and nutrition science has evolved greatly over the kind of years. We've been able to feed more people due to advances in food science, all those kinds of things. And some people say that this is a net negative, though, because now we have these hyper processed foods and people are just eating too much of it. We have Oreos that you can eat a million of. So there's kind of the net positives and the net negatives. What do you think about this? Where has our evolution of our diet been a net positive thus far, or are we doing ourselves a harm by continuing to evolve nutritional sciences and all these things?
Yeah, so I think we need to, on this question, distinguish between the role of science in developing our understanding of the impact of nutrients and nutrition on the body and total dietary patterns and how that influences health versus the influence of the food industry, which utilizes science itself, utilizes methods of research to better understand how people can respond, to a bar of chocolate or otherwise. And I think the problem that we have now, and probably developed initially slowly after the post Second World War period, and then really exponentially started to explode from about the 1960s onwards, is that food industry that uses scientific methods to improve the creation of our current food supply, from its perspective, improve. From our perspective, the products that are being produced are incredibly detrimental and harmful to human health over the lifetime and cause disease. They're two different and indeed diametrically opposed paradigms. And this is the problem. So we have the academic discipline of nutrition science that's trying to understand how food, does good for the body, so to speak, or indeed how food maybe doesn't, and understanding that, so we can, intervene and reduce or offset disease risk. And then on the other side, we have the industry, which is producing a food supply and a food environment that is quite literally killing people. And both of those cannot necessarily exist in complete isolation. Um, but the problem is we exist in a particular, certainly in countries like the US and the UK, Ireland similar, and some other Western countries, we exist with a particular socio-economic and political philosophy that guides the role of industry and markets. And so in any other kind of sane system, we would look at this and say, well, on the one hand, we have the academic discipline trying to understand and indeed producing evidence that shows that, for example, this dietary pattern increases your risk, this dietary pattern decreases your risk. But then on the other hand, we have this completely unchecked industrial science, food industry creating this supply. And so you're never going to have the ability from the academic side to have your findings really make that much of an impact when you've got a food industry that is in control of the entire food supply, from production to of the actual raw materials, to the production of the food products, to their dissemination in the population, to their marketing and advertising. Uh, they control every aspect to it. So this is the problem: is that both of these exist in a competing tension where there can only ever be one winner, and that's the food industry. And we have a prevailing socioeconomic political doctrine that says you never do anything to fetter with the market. The market should be free and unimpeded. Let the market decide. Now, in principle, that only works if we assume that the market is a neutral, benevolent actor, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we know we this is a failed experiment. Like, we know that's categorically not the case. And in the extreme circumstances of deregulation, we know that ultimately the market ends up producing grossly inequitable outcomes, disproportionately impacting the most disadvantaged in society, which is certainly what the food environment and the food industry does. And yet we can't have any serious conversation about intervening at the level of industry because we're told, well, you can't do that. That would be and the subtext there is that would be to fetter with profit. So,
Mm-hmm.
So science and the academic discipline of nutrition is being asked to compete with the private sector. It can't do that. And what we have is this really bizarre dichotomy where the private sector drives the public health. And
Yeah.
that really shouldn't be the status quo at all. And it's little wonder in that context that the industry side of food science and technology in an unregulated scenario has produced the level of sickness associated with a sick food supply and food environment.
So it sounds like we have two opposing sides, and we just have the food industry that is maximizing profits, doing what they can to increase their revenue, despite what is happening kind of on the population level, especially with the people that they are affecting. All they're doing is trying to increase their profits. And then you have kind of the scientists on the sidelines being like, hey, we probably shouldn't be doing that. Probably shouldn't be doing that either. Probably should
Yeah.
make food this way. But obviously, they're not going to listen because that would hamper their profits. I think on one side we have kind of nutritional guidelines that are created by the scientists within nutritional science that are kind of out there to help people decide within this food environment that the food industry is providing which foods you should gravitate towards. However, one of the issues that I've seen with that is that these nutritional guidelines are somewhat disregarded in a sense where they look
Yes.
at the government providing or whoever provides these nutritional guidelines because they come from like nutrition.gov or whatever the websites may be. And people say, oh, they don't know that much about nutrition. It's the government. I'm going to trust private industry as well because for some reason we have this culture of private industry being better than what the government can provide, at least here in the United States. So, what can we do to kind of translate those nutritional guidelines better? Because I don't think us, as the nutritional community, the medical community, is ever going to be able to go up to industry and say, hey, don't make those things. So, how do we kind of translate our guidelines better?
Yeah, I think that becomes a really unenviable task as far as the difficulty of it. Like our guidelines, and the guidelines come in for massive stick, and they are a bone of contention, particularly for people who are of a certain dietary persuasion and they feel that our dietary guidelines, for example, turned people away from eating a diet of meat and milk and eggs and butter. It's kind of like, okay, well, there's a conversation we could have around that. But I think the problem is based on our current available evidence from both observational prospective cohort studies and from intervention studies. If people adhered to the guidelines, their health would be immeasurably improved, right? We absolutely
Definitely.
know that. Quantitatively, we know that their risk factors would be improved significantly. We know that they would have lower risk of mortality, all cause, and specific outcomes like cardiovascular disease. So the guidelines are clearly not the problem. Again, it comes back to this competing tension between the fact that you've got public health guidelines, but the primary driver of people's food intake in the population, the primary driver of the composition of our diets is the food industry. And so the question of how do we get people to better adhere to characteristics of our dietary guideline recommendations is really then a question of, well, how ultimately can we reshape the food environment? And we're not really going to be able to do that just from public health messaging. We know that there can be some responsiveness to public health messaging, but the evidence from that area is pretty clear that after a while, there's a saturation effect. We know that the people that are also most likely to be responsive to public health messaging are people who are generally more well educated, middle class and up, have more disposable income. So if they hear a public health message that eating, kale and tomatoes is good for you, they're likely to do it, but they're starting from a higher health profile baseline already. Whereas, if we're telling people that fruits and vegetables are good for you, but they're living in really inadequate housing in an area of high levels of social deprivation, they may not. We think fruits and vegetables, yeah, they're good, but they're also perishable food items. It may not make economic sense for a family in that circumstance to buy perishable food items if their aim is to just make sure that they're getting enough to eat to be satisfied. So this is why coming back to that idea of what is preventative medicine, I mean, it's a systems wide approach to addressing these issues at the whole population level. I don't think we're ever going to get people. Let's say, for example, the 5 a day fruit and veg recommendations, right? Gram amounts that averages out at about 400 grams of vegetables and fruit a day. We're not going to be able to get people at the whole in the population to reach those targets unless, for example, we're facilitating that there's access to these foods in lower income areas in the first place. That people have the capacity to be able to store them properly, or that if it's in the case of vegetables, there's time, there's preparation skills that come into it. So we need to always, I think, when we talk about like, well, how do we get people to implement this diet or this change, we need to, I think, from the nutrition standpoint, think less about just the act of what that food is and where you might get it, and actually start thinking about all these wider contextual factors that prevent people from doing it in the first place.
We want to take a quick break to remind you that this podcast is not intended for medical advice and is for educational and informational purposes only. We also want to remind you of our Instagram page at PreventPod, where we share various content relating to each episode that you can share with your friends if you enjoy our episode. And lastly, don't forget to sign up for our mailing list so you know right away when an episode goes up at www.thepreventivemedicinepodcast.com. And with that, let's get back into this episode. So you mentioned a couple of things in there. I want to touch on and bring up education level, as you mentioned, that people with a higher education level are those that will tend to be more coherent to guidelines, and they'll say, oh, I don't really want to do this way because the guidelines say so. I don't understand kind of where those guidelines are coming from, that I'm going to adhere to it. However, on the other side, you still have people that are very highly educated that end up falling into very strong dogmatic patterns of dietary eating, whether it's a specific low carb camp, whether it is a, let's say, completely plant-based camp. And you have people that either perpetuate or just buy into fad diets. And I'm going to ask two questions here. Number one, why, despite education levels, do you think people fall into these fad diets so strongly, despite somewhat knowing that you can critically appraise things, like, say, even physicians, that we know in our training, we are somewhat trained to critically appraise data, whether it's medication, all of that. So that's one question. Why do they fall into these traps? And number two, how do you break the cycle of fad dieting? Because a lot of these people who do create these fad diets put it on social media, gain a large following, and then this kind of filters down to those maybe in lower socioeconomic statuses, which makes it more confusing for them because they're like, oh, we have these guidelines here, but now we also have these fad diets. What do I do? And they might not have the knowledge level to discern kind of what is better for them.
Yeah. So the diet allegiance thing is really interesting, and it's interesting. You mentioned physicians, even because it's something that I've really noticed in the UK is a lot of medical doctors, endocrinologists, people that I would expect to be able to maintain that level of critical appraisal and be conscious of things like bias, like end up becoming the biggest dogmatists for some of these diets. And
Exactly.
it's wild to see, but
I don't understand it at all.
no, I don't get it. Like, I don't get how they can still go around thinking they're credible. Like, and I have friends of mine that are, say dietitians here, and they'll say they'll have, some, like an endocrinologist or a cardiologist will say, everything you're doing is wrong. It's like, you should have your patients on a low carb diet, or you should have your patients on a carnivore diet. It's like, how did you get to this point? And it really makes me worry then about, like, well, if they've bought into this with a diet, like, what's the rest of their practice like? Like, are they actually putting people in harm's way? But what this speaks to is, I think, nutrition is kind of unique as a science, as a health science. It's the only area of health science that I can think of that simultaneously doubles up as a human belief system, right? We know that diet is something that varies across the whole world. It varies for cultural reasons, religious reasons, you know, regional regions, even just geographical and otherwise. It varies for ethical and moral reasons. So it's very unique to have a subject like that that has all of these inputs into what ultimately we end up studying as an exposure. It's I can't think I know nothing about physics, for example, but physics doesn't strike me as a field that has religious implications or ethical and moral implications or regional differences. Like, I'm sure E equals MC squared in Norway as much as it does in Chicago and Sydney. So I don't know why we kind of have a difficulty with nutrition to sometimes separate that out. I think people, because it's also something that every single one of us requires for life, right? We need nutrients for life. You need a base amount of nutrition in your diet as a human being to sustain life. And that makes it unique as well. So, people might like do other, even exposures like cigarette smoking or alcohol. Maybe someone drinks twice a week, or maybe they used to smoke more but now they smoke like 3 a day. But with food, people eat multiple times a day. They spend most of the day in a fed state. So it's something that everyone does at this very personal level, whether it's conscious or not. And I think that creates this unique place that makes it very susceptible to people becoming very beholden to ideas and beliefs rather than evidence and reason. um, and I think that's why we see, independent of education status, we see people falling for this kind of stuff because of that very human tendency to want to identify with a camp, to want to be part of a tribe. And we've done this with heaps of things over the years, and we continue to do it with political affiliations or other aspects of people's lives where they affiliate, even if it's just supporting a football team. So diet, just unfortunately for an area of science, also is one of these things that falls into that kind of camp, and makes people, independent of how smart or educated they are, unfortunately really susceptible to be drawn into the narratives that that particular group has created for themselves.
Outside of really enjoying pizza for myself, I think I've broken outside of the cycle of fad diets. I still eat a lot of pizza. That might be considered a fad. Probably not. But how do people get out of these fad diets? Because it seems like in our diet culture that people just go from one diet to another, where you'll have one mega influencer, one physician, let's say an endocrinologist, say that you should be eating low carb because it'll be better for you. And then after some time, this person does low carb. They either stick to it long term or they feel, okay, this isn't sustainable. Let's find something else. And the cardiologist over here saying you have to go completely vegan. And then they do 100%, 180, and eat only plants. And then people just keep kind of bouncing back and forth. And it seems to be a pattern that a lot of people do this for their entire lives, unfortunately. How do you think people can break out of this? And what's kind of the best way? Because it doesn't seem like education is the best way necessarily to break out of these diets, right?
No, I don't think education is. I don't think just merely telling someone, look, dairy's not going to give you cancer, or, like eating just meat is not a great idea. Yeah. So I think this comes down to more trying to help people understand like the critical thinking side and the fallacy side. And I think that approach is probably more helpful than just trying to sit down and discuss evidence or science. It's to use that kind of street epistemology approach and actually start to probe someone as to, like, okay, that's interesting. Like, why do you believe this? And get them to actually be the one. I think the problem is we have this desire, which is completely natural because we come from evidence based modalities. This is the way we're kind of taught and trained. So if we hear someone say, well, I think an all meat diet and no vegetables is the best diet for human health, our kind of response is, well, that's not true. And we kind of end up going into this very didactic kind of sciencey mode. Like, I'm going to show you evidence why this is not the case. They don't care about
Yeah.
evidence. Like, they've arrived at a point where all they're eating is ribeye steak. Like, evidence is not the problem here. So, so I think it's more to kind of probe like their beliefs and get them to justify their beliefs, and that's often where people end up exposing themselves. And I think that approach is possibly more helpful to get people out of fad diets, is to get them to justify their beliefs, for you to probe why it is they think that way in the first place. What thinking are they going into? And then to try and highlight some of those fallacies within that. Like, oh, well, if I ate lentils and that was all I ate, would I be healthy? And see what justification they'd say no, and see what justification they give, and then kind of explore that justification. So it might go something like, well, no, because that doesn't have all the nutrients, and red meat does have all the nutrients. And like, well, if that's your justification, then you can kind of start to then show the flaws in the thinking. And I think that's more efficacious than trying to just like show someone a paper and say this isn't true, because that's not what they're there. That's not what got them
Yeah.
there, and it's not what's going to bring them back. They got there because of bad
Definitely.
thinking, and trying to cultivate better thinking is what's going to get them back.
Now, do you think that could be done on a larger like policy or legislative level, or through the power of social media, through education, on through like various posts of like taking people through these logical fallacies of their own thought process? But the problem there is that I don't think people are going to be intrinsically looking at an Instagram post and thinking in their head, because people just scroll past. So, does this sound like more of an individual effort between some sort of healthcare provider or some sort of dietitian, nutrition provider, or can this be done on a larger level?
I don't think it can be done on a larger level, because social media, as it currently is formulated, and the algorithms amplify the lowest common denominator. And they amplify outrage. They amplify, like, you look at Liver King, for example. I remember when I first,
We're just gonna drop the name at this point.
yeah, I mean, I'm sure, like, because he's now got something like 2.4 million followers.
Yeah.
You know, I have 50,000. Like, I can't compete with that unless I start eating like bull testicles, and I'm not particularly inclined to do that. So the fact, because I remember when I first was sent his account, people being like, "Look at this." I think he had something in the region of like maybe over 100,000, in that kind of like 100, and
Mhm.
within the space of 3 months, he's up in the millions. Like, that's everything that's wrong with social media. It's again, it's everything that's wrong with everything on the platforms being targeted towards just pure and utter outrage, right? Because all he's doing is marketing. Like, it's marketing genius. He owns an ancestral supplements company, so the best way to sell that is to grow the reach of their platform. But the supplements are secondary to him just doing outrageous stunts, like eating, fish eggs straight from the fish's ass and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, no one can compete with that, trying to communicate science and evidence. Like, you just can't. So we're not going to do that on any sort of mass level. And we know that public health kind of initiatives like are largely not gonna work. So
Yeah.
this is where, from the preventative aspect, this is where the whole population type approach is never sufficient in isolation. It always requires targeted interventions at a more individual level, and this is an example of where more targeted, one to one work is going to better disabuse people of these ideas. And there is a role for social media in this. I will have messages from people, saying, I used to think this, that, and the other, or I was in this diet camp and I found your page, and like, it's really like made me see what was wrong with that, and come back and think a bit more critically, and blah blah blah. And I really appreciate those messages, but I also find them devastating because I realize this is just one person in a sea of madness,
Yeah.
and so, and that makes me realize how small scale the potential for that kind of change. If you think you're going to change things on social media or with wider media, it's just not going to happen. Um, so yeah, I think that's something that is just going to be at an individual level, and there are inevitably going to be huge chunks of people who are lost to these diet tribes and fads, and probably until something bad happens for their health that makes them realize maybe the error of their ways. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, that's often what it takes, isn't it? Right? It takes someone to get sick or have some sort of adverse, consequence of whatever weird and wonderful and extreme diet they've adopted, and in order for them to maybe second guess what got them there in the first place.
And the irony of all this is that most of these fad diets or whatnot are always in the name of prevention, where they're always,
Right,
this is
right.
the ideal diet, this is what is going to prevent you from getting a triple vessel surgery on your heart or
Hmm.
something of the like, or prevent you from getting a stroke. And this is the irony of it, which is why it makes me kind of sad about all this, because you have someone who's out there following Liver King, eating nothing but like steak, whatever it may be, increasing their cholesterol levels. Next thing you know, they're going to get atherosclerosis, heart attack, all those kinds of things. And unfortunately, some of the people that suffer the most from these kinds of things and these diets are those in those lower socioeconomic
Yeah.
communities. And because they can't afford to eat steak every day, they'll maybe either buy the supplements or they'll do what they can in order to kind of adhere with this, because they think, oh, this is probably the best diet. And you were talking about those of lower socioeconomic status mostly benefiting from those larger dietary guidelines or this policy like changes. And I want to come back to that, because
Mm.
we can't just have people wait for these like policy level things change, because in my opinion, at least, I don't foresee that changing, at least in the US.
No.
So on a individual practical level, what do you think people of lower socioeconomic status can do kind of in the face of all these fad diets, all this stuff on Instagram, and the dietary guidelines not really going to change? What can they do?
Yeah, it's look, it's challenging. I think there's also additional challenges with the fact that often lower income areas don't necessarily even have some of the big chain supermarkets. You would think they would, but they often don't. And so this concept of like food desert and stuff has emerged. And sometimes local stores, although they might have a lot of food produce, they're actually more expensive because they don't have the economies of scale to be able to like sell a lot of produce for much cheaper prices the way like
Hmm.
a Trader Joe's or something would. But so I think there are a number of things that can kind of be done. I think you have a lot of staple foods that aren't necessarily that expensive. Like beans and legumes and rice and grains, and these foods are all very health promoting. They're also not necessarily expensive. The barrier there then tends to be food preparation and time. So someone might have access to these more staple foods, but they may not necessarily have food preparation skills in order to make that tin of beans, for example,
Yep.
into a nice chili or something. And then there's the time factor as well. So I think one of the difficulties with this conversation is we tend to start like talking about these barriers as if they're almost uniform, and they're not. So everyone is going to differ in terms of what challenges they have in terms of improving diet. So I think what people are best to do is to actually identify like what's my barrier here. Is it time? Is it food preparation skills? Is it, just not really knowing what might be good foods that are maybe not perishable or cheaper to buy? Where do I go in a supermarket for this kind of thing? And so I think it's like identifying the lowest hanging fruit. Like what's the biggest barrier that prevents them from doing things? And most people have an idea of what that barrier is, right? Um, and then trying to remove that so that the strategy or whatever they do to try and remove that is really going to differ based on whatever the barrier is. So for someone with time barrier, it might be trying to batch cook, right? Let's say time is their barrier. Maybe they try and like batch cook a large amount of food on maybe a Sunday or something like that. If it's food preparation skills, maybe it's just but they have time. Maybe it's just taking that kind of extra. effort to even follow YouTube videos and like try and develop on that front. If it's really a knowledge deficit as far as like what foods are actually healthy, then it's seeking out, and again, this is where I would actually encourage people to just like actually follow the guidelines in that sense. Like
Mhm.
they're not going to result in a negative outcome, and it keeps people away from the noise as far as people that are raging over what should or shouldn't be eaten. So it's really challenging with the socioeconomic status aspect of this conversation. There's just no uniform answer, and it really just does depend on this on the circumstances in which any kind of individual finds themselves in. So I tend to answer that by saying, what's the biggest barrier, and how could that be addressed or attenuated or circumvented in some way?
Now, I know you are a huge history buff. I think you did your undergrad in classics and history, right? Is that correct? I want to ask you a little bit. I'm sure you've read a little bit. I don't know how much you've read, but these lower socioeconomic areas, I think, are pretty. I think they're the key to improving public health on a large scale. Because now, as a physician, what I see is those people who do have those adverse outcomes are typically those of a lower socioeconomic status, just
Mhm.
because of chronic disease building up over time due to poor nutritional habits, poor whatever it may be. So I think that's really a key to improving public health from a preventive standpoint. How did these lower socioeconomic statuses, like the people within these communities, come to be in this position? Because it seems like it's just getting worse and worse with access to foods, with access to medicine, with access to all of this. So I don't know how much you can speak on this. This might be a very broad, crazy question, but
Well,
what is driving this?
well, I mean, we've always had, certainly in Western countries, there has always been a degree of a class system. Um, and so, we had the classical world is really interesting because their societies were ordered based on this assumed natural hierarchy, right? So there was this assumption that the natural world, including human beings, had hierarchies in it, that there were bigger dogs than smaller dogs, and that some people were born as either royalty or of noble birth, for example, and that some people were born slaves, for example, and this was your lot because it was preordained by nature. And with the fall of certainly the Western Roman Empire and the emergence of early Christianity, you had this actual shift to a way more egalitarian society. But then you have the emergence of the feudal system in Western Europe, where you really have people who own land and then power, and people living on the land and generally serving that landowner. And so we have these kind of social structures that emerged, that in some parts of Europe, like the feudal system in Russia really really went right up until the Bolshevik Revolution in many respects. In Western Europe, we see it slowly erode away as more kind of different systems start to emerge, and more kind of democratic systems in many senses. Um, and then, of course, America, is founded out of a lot of what would have been that early, Enlightenment period in Europe, and then some of these ideas transported over there. But we still had, and always had, certainly within the colonial system that emerged in Europe, these distinctions being made arbitrarily on people's status in society, with slavery being one of the worst examples of that. So we've always had societies that have either arbitrarily or by force put structures and hierarchies on the social order. And I think when we start to see it really come into play with nutrition over the Industrial Revolution, and people's diets were absolutely horrendous during that period. And it's when modern nutrition science starts to emerge. But really, what you have in that period is you have the emergence of specific regions, where the town or the city is dominated by a particular industry, and that's fine for the period of that industry. But if that industry is rendered obsolete or changes or just desists, then you have these areas that go into terminal kind of decline. So you have that, for example, with the Rust Belt in the US, or you have it with the north of England here in the old mining and shipping industry towns. And the problem is, unless they're given support, these areas tend to, we know that factors like low education attainment perpetuates intergenerationally. We know that even things like trauma, perpetuate intergenerational trauma, is like a recognized phenomenon within psychology now. And we also know that nutrition as a part of this will actually, there's a lot of interest now in utero exposures and maternal nutrition during pregnancy, the immediate period. And so if you've got these factors that are influencing health status and they're compounding generationally, and then those areas are getting nothing by way of new industry or new or support, then you end up with these, or, where we have now these enormous gross inequalities between, say, where I am, London, for example. London on the whole would be considered this very affluent major European city. But the inequality within London's so bad that in one of the areas, the borough, the kind of council areas within London, which is Chelsea and Kensington. Now, for most people, they hear that here and they think Chelsea, Kensington is very posh, right? That's its reputation. But between the richest and the poorest in that area of London, the life expectancy difference now is 22 years. This is
Wow.
wild. This is the sixth richest country in the world, and the life expectancy difference is 22 years. We see this now in America with declining life expectancies in the southern states and the Rust Belt, but you compare that to, say, Silicon Valley or California or New York or some of the kind of more urban metropolises. So there's this enormous urban rural divide. Um, and there have been various points in history where political systems have attempted to actually address these inequalities. America had this period from the New Deal onwards, from the Great Depression, that led to this period in American life where everyone still looks back to as if that's the hallmark, the kind of post World War II period where America geographically was fortunate to not suffer like actual cities destroyed. So you've got this really high quality of life. You've got rising living. You've got rising real wages. You've got people who worked what would be blue collar jobs were able to put children through college. You don't have that anymore. We don't have it anymore. The lack of social mobility, I think, is a major issue here, and the kind of absence of a social conscience from democracy got hijacked somewhere around. Most of the kind of economists and economic historians would kind of identify the late 1970s as a period where this idea of democracy existing to facilitate a free market rather than democracy controlling a market to allow it, and not entirely controlling it, but at least putting bounds on it to allow it to produce outcomes that improved everyone's life. Um, so we have this long history of arbitrary hierarchy and inequality amongst human beings in societies. But we've also had these inflection points where there's been periods of systems to actually improve that, and we've seen those improvements. But now, over the past 40 years, with the very hyper kind of neoliberal economic model, we're now seeing life expectancy decrease in the poorest communities. We're seeing people dying way younger before COVID, if they're the poorest versus the richest. We're seeing gross levels of disproportionate ill health amongst communities in rural areas or former industrial areas. The opioid epidemic in the US, we see the same, not the same extent here, but alcoholism rates. And these are generational issues, unfortunately, and there's no one that I can see, certainly not in the States or not in the UK, politically, that seems like they've got any decent answers to these questions.
Now, this is one of the exact reasons that I am starting to talk about these things, because I've realized that beyond the individual level, if you want to talk about actual preventive medicine and health, that you have to start learning about history. You have to learn why all these systems are in place the way that they are, why all these specific populations are being affected. So you can kind of reverse these and guide policies towards that level. And like you
Mm.
were mentioning, I don't see any politicians who are kind of keen to these, who understand what's going on, who know why it's going on, and have the aptitude to kind of think and create policy to solve that solutions. And this is why I invited you on, because outside of the individual, let's talk about vitamin E or vitamin D, I think that
Yeah,
at this point that's kind of pointless, right? Because if we really want to improve health, we're not talking about vitamin D. We're talking about policy to maybe improve access to food, to cooking food, and all of those things. And
yeah,
I hope for the listeners back home, this wasn't very boring, or they were expecting something to talk about vitamin E. But this is
yeah,
what I think true nutrition is at this point.
yeah. I'm in complete agreement, mate.
So we're going to start wrapping this up. And our classic question, which also could tend to either be very basic or somehow get very complex, is if you are at your Starbucks or local roaster, someone comes up to you, recognize you, hey, you're Alan from Alinea Nutrition, right? How do I get healthy? What do you tell them in 2 minutes?
Uh, Sleep more, stress less, get some outdoor light exposure every day, and eat plenty of vegetables.
All right, that
Some fruit.
works.
Yeah.
Easier said than done, though. And then the
Yes,
implementation, that's a whole different story, right?
exactly.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I really enjoyed having you on. I learned a lot from this. I selfishly have a lot of these guests on that know a lot more about various topics, so that I can start getting introduced to them and do my own research later on. But
Great.
I hope the guests back home enjoyed this. Alan, where can people find you? I already have all your links, but what do you want people to see? Where do you want people to find you?
Yeah, so I actually keep social media fairly narrow. So it's just Instagram. So I'm there at the nutritional underscore advocate. Alinea Nutrition is my site. It's a research review focused specifically on nutrition science. And then you'll also find me at Sigma Nutrition with the Sigma Nutrition podcast that Danny Lennon and myself and also Dr. Neve Aspel produce. And there's also written materials on Sigma Nutrition as well that I've authored. So they're the three places I hang out basically.
And I would highly suggest those. I am an avid reader of a lot of those. Very good information. Alan, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Great chat.